Welcome back to the Cycling Iceberg podcast, everyone. I'm pleased to announce that the podcast series is back. I'm back from vacation, I'm back from a bit of work in there as well. So now I can dedicate myself a bit to this podcast series again. I really enjoyed making them during the Tour de France, but I know I won't be able to keep up that frequency for the remainder of this series. But I aim to make 1 or 2 podcast episodes a week, definitely until the end of the road season. But honestly, my goal is to continue doing that. Well, not until the end of times, but definitely for the upcoming year. I've really enjoyed making these episodes. As during the tour, I like to link these podcast episodes to something that's currently going on in cycling, so an ongoing race, and in the tour even places that the current race is visiting. But that's not always possible, so before the Vuelta starts, I have a couple of rider profiles I've written that I would like to cover first. Personally, I've always had a soft spot for riders coming up through the ranks from non-traditional cycling countries. I really enjoyed seeing Tekla Heimanot in the KOM jersey. I've always liked to see the South American riders do well, but also from within Europe, I've been intrigued by the riders from the Baltics. It's maybe a little bit before I started watching cycling fully, but in the post-Soviet wave, you could see that there were strong riders from Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, a really strong generation of Baltic riders. So I did a deep dive and found some research on them. So I'll be covering a couple of profiles like that before the Vuelta starts. Starting this short rider profile series, we're gonna kick it off with Raimondas Rumsas, a Lithuanian rider. In 1996, Rumsas signed his first pro contract with Polish second division team Muros. He had appeared on the team's radar when he won the Polish race Course de la Solidarité Olympique in 1994. Despite that win, which was quite a big race in Poland at the time, Rumsas wasn't considered a big talent. A year prior, so in 1993, he'd finished just 66 at the Amateur World Championships. His results in 96 and 97 for Muros weren't special, but he did see his contract get extended. He was seen as a loyal worker, a lieutenant. From there, Rumsas continued to progress, such that he's currently portrayed as the pioneer of Lithuanian cycling. But that's only partially correct. The Baltic country did already have a rich history of cycling. Gintautas Umaras and Arturas Kasputis had already become Olympic team pursuit champion, albeit for the Soviet Union. Once the Berlin Wall was brought down, Kasputis performed really well under the Lithuanian flag. After a year at Manzana Postabon, Kasputis did several seasons with Chazal, which later became Ag d'Isère. He finished third in the 1994 Dauphiné and won the first stage of the Dauphiné in 1996. Kasputis was the real pioneer of Lithuanian cycling in the post-Soviet era. But that's not to take away from the legacy of Rumsas, because he became arguably the biggest superstar. At the 1998 World Championships, held in Valkenburg, several top riders were absent. They had conflicts with the UCI over the date of the race, but also their newly implemented anti-doping regulations. This World Championship took place in the wake of the 1998 Tour de France, which was nicknamed Tour de Dopage. There were several teams caught up in doping scandals, mostly related to team use of EPO. The riders that were there in Valkenburg faced abysmal weather conditions. It was pouring down all day. As a result of these combinations, the tough weather conditions, the open race because many favorites were absent, an interesting group of some 15 riders went up the road. There were several top riders in this group. There was 1993 world champion Lance Armstrong, Dutch rider Michael Bogert, one of the favorites, Italian superstar Michele Bartoli, he was probably the outright favorite before the race, but there were also several unknown factors. There were 3 Swiss riders, including Oscar Kamenzind, a rider who was a mailman not too long ago. Rumsas was also a surprising name up there, but the commentators had little attention for him. The race was action-packed, and it didn't take long before that lead group started splitting apart again. The Lithuanian couldn't follow the front runners, but did end up in the second group. This group sprinted for 8th place in the end. Italy's Andrea Tafi won that sprint, with Rumsas coming second. The 9th place at the World Championships was by far the best result in his career. It was a sign of what was to come. Despite this result, Rumsas remained under the radar. Kamenzind, the Swiss mailman, had won the World Championships. he was one of the most surprising world champions ever in the history of the sport. All newspapers profiled him. Who was Kamenzint? How did he pull this off? What did this mean for his future? That meant that there was no attention for Rumsas in the Western papers at all. He quickly disappeared off the radar of the few people who had even noticed him in that lead group. What certainly didn't help for Rumsas' public appeal was that he still raced for his small Polish team. He raced mainly smaller races, although in 1999, just before the turning of the century, the Lithuanian performed exceptionally well in those races. He finished second in Cours de la Paix and won 2 stages in the Tour of Poland. He finally stepped up, signing a deal with Varsa Bortolo, a Tier 1 team, for the 2000 season. Signing riders from non-traditional countries was still considered relatively risky at the time. It was a high-risk, potentially high-reward situation, but in the media, people were always skeptical. Could they really find their groove in Italy? Could they find their groove in wherever they're going to be settling? Does it really work out? For Varsa Bortolo, it certainly worked out, because their new Lithuanian rider, Rumsas, performed well in the second half of the 2000 season. In the beginning, he did indeed struggle to settle in, but he finished 4th in Burgos and 2nd in Coppa Bernocchi. Then, he made his Grand Tour debut in the Vuelta, in which he finished 5th. It's important to note that the 5th place was a positive result for Rumsas, but it wasn't highly rated at all. The Vuelta was after all still a mostly Spanish affair at the time, with just a few other riders missing in. Especially with the Olympics shortly after, few top riders attended the 3rd Grand Tour of the year. Furthermore, Rumsas raced in Zubeldia style, although it was maybe Zubeldia before Zubeldia. He didn't finish in the top 5 of a single stage, so despite his potential being visible to a few experts, he still remained under the radar. After participations at the Olympics and the World Championships didn't yield much return, Rumsas raced I Lombardia as final race of the 2000 season. The action started super early in the 260km race. Just 60k in, defending champion Mirko Celestoni from Polti launched his first attack on the Madonna di Galicia climb. He got away with a strong group, which included the 1998 world champion Kamenzint, but they got caught again. With 120k to go, a new strong leading group formed on the rolling terrain around Bergamo. Andrea Perron from Varsa Bortolo initiated the attack. He got followed by Paris Tours winner Andrea Taffi from Mapai, Kamenzint, and freshly minted world champion Roman Weinsteins, a Latvian rider racing for Caldirola. Weinsteins, however, quickly sat up, prompting Kamenzint to do the same. Such a long duo attack was too much of an ask. Everything came back together on the Selvino, the toughest climb of the day. It, however, wasn't that climb that forced a race-deciding split, it was the descent. Pre-race favourite Michele Bartoli from Mapai was the biggest name up front. Beat Zberg from Rabobank, Francesco Casgrande from Caldirola, and Davide Rebellin from Liquigas were also great classic riders who made the cut. Then there were several more surprising names in that group. There was the unknown Swede Niklas Axelsson, also from Caldirola, and Rumsas, who had support from his teammate Vladimir Belli. There were 2 climbs remaining, the Berbeno and the shorter Boccolo, just before the finish in Bergamo. Halfway up the Berbeno, Axelsson attacked hard and surprised the others. The tall, skinny Swede was feeling good, and by the time Belli and Casgrande reacted, he was already out of sight. All eyes were on Bartoli, but he had put in a big effort to make the split and was in trouble on the 5km climb. He got dropped, although he did manage to come back in the downhill. With 20 kilometers to go, the lanky Swede Axelsson was holding his chasers at 40 seconds. If he could pull this off, it would be an upset of monumental proportions. Behind him, it was Varsa Bortolo who led the chase. They had 2 riders. Despite the efforts of Varsa Bortolo, mainly Rumsas, Axelsson started the final climb, 7 kilometers from the finish, still with a lead of 40 seconds. It looked in the bag for the Swede, but with 4 kilometers to go, Casgrande launched a big attack from the chasing group. He put all his cards on table. This was it, all or nothing. Everything on the line. Close the gap or fail. Rumsas, despite all his work, was the only one able to follow. And together, they started closing in on the Swedish race leader. On the fast descent towards the line, Axelsson lost time. At the Flamme Rouge, Gasgrande had Axelsson in his sight, with Rumsas glued to the wheel of Gasgrande. The Lithuanian didn't take too many turns. He knew he wasn't the favourite. Gasgrande, much bigger name. He could permit himself to stay in the wheel. As the three made the final turn onto Piazza Matteotti with 300 meters to go, Gasgrande led out the sprint. However, Rumsas, seeking not just his first win of 2000, but his biggest win ever, blasted by with just 75 meters to go. He took the win. Behind, Axelsson slammed his bars in frustration as he came third with a rear flat. Probably without a puncture, it would have been the Swede who had been at the center of this Iceberg story, and not Rumsas, the surprising Lithuanian winner of a cycling monument. Rumsas' win was a huge upset, an upset of gigantic proportions, according to some papers. He was a virtual nobody who apparently came out of the blue to win one of the biggest one-day races of the year. And at 28, the best years of his career appeared to have just been starting. Of course, that impression that he came out of the blue isn't fully correct. Those who looked at his results knew that he'd shown signs of potential. So you might wonder, well, did this win in Lombardia change the appearances around Rumsas? Did he become a future superstar of the sport? No, there still wasn't much talk about Rumsas being the next big thing. The Lithuanian had grown up on a farm in Silgali, 80 kilometers from the Baltic Sea. He was a modest and somewhat introverted appearance in the peloton. The expectations might not have been the highest, but that didn't stop Rumsas from performing well in 2001. He finished second in Paris-Nice, 6th in Liège-Bastogne-Liège, and won the Tour of the Basque Country. However, Forza Bortolo had signed Gasgrande as new team leader. The Italian didn't get along with the Lithuanian, who he perceived as a major threat to his position. Therefore, Rumsas, despite being the best performer on the team, was kept away from the big races, meaning he again remained under the radar for the general public. He decided to leave the team at the end of the season, signing a new deal with Italian team Lampre. His first season with Lampre started in stark contrast to their bright pink jersey. Rumsas raced anonymously, but was selected to race the Tour nevertheless. He wasn't mentioned in any of the 10 previews I checked. Favorites for the 2000 Tour? Lance Armstrong from US Postal. Big favorite to win a 4th straight Tour. Main opposition? Joseba Belocchi, Igor Gonzalez from Once Duo, Christophe Moreau from AG Dessert, Levi Leipheimer from Rabobank, and Tyler Hamilton from CSC. Rumsas, however, believed he could do well. When his team told him to aim for maybe a top 10, he wanted to have nothing to do with that. He told his team, the top 10 is nothing. I want to go for a podium. Director Sportief at Lampre, Brett Copeland, shrugged at this interaction. He knew Rumsas could be very direct at times, but besides that, nobody in the team really knew much about him. He was a bit of a mystery. But what they did know was that Rumsas was an incredible bike rider, and it showed. At 30 years old, he made his Tour debut and immediately finished third in the prologue. He was now part of the race he had discovered 17 years ago. Back then, he came across pictures of the race in L'Équipe. L'Équipe was available on the other side of the Iron Curtain. He cut out Bernard Hinault, Greg LeMond, Laurent Fignon, saving those cutouts in his room. He didn't fully understand what the race was, as it wasn't shown on TV, but he was convinced it had to be the most beautiful thing in the world. In the biggest race of the world, Rumsas held up well in the first week. Despite a bad team time trial, in which he lost 2:30, he stood in the top 10 of the general classification after the first week. In the Pyrenees, Rumsas was climbing with the stars of the race. He placed 5th on La Mongie, 6th on Plateau de Bay, moving up into 4th, just 2 minutes off a podium position. Rumsas reached the second rest day 3rd in GC, after a fabulous display on the Mont Ventoux. He was the second strongest climber out of the GC riders, having to only let Armstrong go. He could become the first Lithuanian rider to ever stand on the podium of the Tour. It was only now that media attention finally increased for Rumsas. Several newspapers were interested in how he was suddenly one of the top climbers. Because his good results had remained unnoticed, his performance was extra surprising to the general public. The only worry around the Lithuanian going into the final week was the strength of his team. Could he hold up without strong climbing support? Rumsas himself didn't really care about the cited lack of support. In fact, he was extremely thankful to his team, making a point out of it to thank every rider in the bus after the stage, no matter how much or how little they had contributed that day. Instead of fearing attacks from behind, Rumsas could in fact look forward during the final week. He remained one of the best climbers, and the second place in the final TT saw him come just a minute short of second place in GC. Without a mechanical in that race against the clock, he could have made an even stronger challenge. However, things took a turn. On the day that Rumsas stood on the Tour podium in Paris, his wife got arrested at the Mont Blanc tunnel. Her car was loaded with growth hormone, testosterone, anabolic steroids, and several other PhDs. She was on her way to Tuscany, where the couple would stay after the tour. Lampre immediately suspended the Lithuanian, even though he claimed innocence. He said, quote, "I've never taken anything. My tour is clean. These medications were for my mother-in-law." There were other reports. Those suggested that his wife confessed to the police these medications were indeed planned to go to Lithuania, but not for her mother. Instead, she was going to donate them to local hospitals. In Lithuania, cycling had become super popular due to Rumsas' third place in the tour. And this helped Rumsas, because as a result of that popularity, the Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs got involved. He told the French ambassador it was unacceptable that Rumsas' wife was kept in custody for so long. Later, the Lithuanian sports authorities also backed their star rider. They tested Rumsas themselves and concluded he was clean. Eventually, no further action was taken against Rumsas. He kept his third place in the tour and got reunited with his partner. Despite his performance, he remained extremely humble and down to earth, saying his popularity was nothing compared to that of Arvydas Sabonis, a Lithuanian NBA player for the Portland Trail Blazers. In 2003, Rumsas finished 6th in the Giro, but he tested positive for EPO not long after. He made a brief comeback, but that EPO positive was essentially the end of his professional career. In 2006, he and his wife got arrested and sentenced to suspended prison sentences for the doping case at the end of the 2002 Tour de France. That result still stands in the book. In 2017, Linas Rumsas, the son of Raimondas, died of a heart attack. It was determined this came as consequence of excessive doping use. There was a big investigation into his team, Altopac. Altopac was one of the biggest amateur teams in Italy, and there was widespread doping use. The manager, Luca Francesi, pushed most of his riders, especially the most talented ones, to use doping and provided them with EPO. Raimondas was briefly investigated, but it was concluded he had nothing to do with the death of his son. A year later, his other son, Raimondas Jr., tested positive for GHPR6. He received a 4-year suspension. Doping was clearly a running thread through the Raimondas family, but still, that performance in the 2002 Tour de France was something that many older cycling fans still remember. It was surprising the way he performed, but as said, that was mainly because he'd been largely overlooked. I think that's what kind of intrigued me into this story. Looking through the results of these riders, in hindsight, it becomes quite clear to see how and why people thought it was worth taking a shot on this rider. But then you need to factor in the context of the time. The traditional media, the newspapers, were more inclined to write about the riders from their own region. They were more inclined to focus on the traditional strong hubs of cycling. Sure, it wasn't the same as it was in the 60s. We'd had Greg LeMond come through, we'd had Stephen Roach come through, we had new markets being drawn into the sport. But still, kind of how it was with the Colombians, and how there was a lot of negative press around Café de Colombia and that Colombians caused crashes in the peloton, the first stars coming through from behind the Iron Curtain were also overlooked. And with that, I think it's interesting to see that context, that a rider who'd clearly shown his potential, winning big races, was still considered a major upset coming out of nowhere to finish second in the Tour.